Hey guys, we are going to cover Friedens Health Impact Pyramid. And as I've told you before, you're going to see this pyramid so many times. So the best thing you could absolutely do is study this, know this, feel good about it, talk about it in your sleep, talk about it in your sleep with your roommate. I don't know, whatever helps you out. But you will see this a fair share of times. So hopefully this recording will help you learn the pyramid. As well as once I get back, I'm out of town right now. I'm actually at my parents' house right now. I've had some family issues pop up. When I get back, I'm going to make a printout of this for you. In the meantime, if you want to take out a piece of paper and draw the pyramid, maybe that'll help you learn this pyramid a little bit better. If you were wondering where this information comes from, it comes from that reading that was due for homework today. Not only did you have the short video, short being an hour, so I guess it's really subjective when you say short, right? But you had the video to watch and read this article. The article is really great, and it gives you a great table in it, which kind of gives you some different examples of each of these tiers and what could fall under each of these tiers. So let's start from the beginning. Who exactly is Frieden? Tom Frieden was the former director for the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is the public health arm of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We've got the NIH, which is more biomedical. The CDC tends to be what we think about when we think of the public health branch. So this is the former CDC director, and he was interested in creating a model that would also take into consideration the social determinants of health when talking about public health planning, and also creating interventions that are aimed at preventing and controlling disease. So this is different than other types of theoretical models because past theoretical models, this might be important, past theoretical models really only took clinical interventions into consideration. So really what was health or what were health interventions, whatever you did when you go to the hospital or washing your hands before surgery or other interventions that took place in a clinic. But we know that public health is so much more than that. We know that public health is all about preventing and controlling disease, and as you guys have heard numerous times and as you've been explaining to me when we talk about examples, it's also about taking into consideration the context for which people live. So Friedens Health Impact Pyramid does just that. It starts really with tier 1 towards the bottom, incorporating social determinants of health, and at tier 5, really focusing more on those interventions where you give people information and they're the ones, the onus is on them, meaning that the responsibility is on the individual to change some type of health behavior to help prevent and control diseases or negative health conditions. In this pyramid, tier 1, so the bottom tier, and by the way, it's important to understand that just because you have tier 1 at the bottom and tier 5 at the top, those numbers, that numbering, it counts and it matters. So again, tier 1, think of this as before you can achieve everything else, you really need to cover your bases on tier 1. Tier 5 takes a little bit less resources, a little bit less collaboration, a little bit less government investment. It's still important, but if you want to create an intervention that has more of a population focus, you're focusing on the bottom tiers, and the top tiers is more of that individualized, give people information, have them go to a clinic. Again, the responsibility for the intervention falls more on the individual who you're trying to help change a certain behavior. All right, so if you take out a pen and paper, I'm going to walk you through these different tiers. All right, tier 1, that very bottom tier, is called Socioeconomic Factors. These are factors such as socioeconomic status, right? Like income, having housing and affordable housing and quality housing, having access to education. What can you do to improve education? These are these basic things we need to be successful individuals and to help prevent and control disease. So often, this is where social policy lies, is how do we make life more affordable for people? Can we raise minimum wage? What might be some outcomes of raising minimum wage? Can we ensure that people have access to housing? Can we build homes with Habitat for Humanity, or have HUD, Housing and Urban Development, set aside different grant funds to build lower income housing where people can qualify and live in those and have a roof over your head temporarily, right? Until you get back on your feet and you're able to earn your own income, pay for housing and other means, right? So if you're thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I know I mentioned this, it's something you'd learn more often in psychology, but where you're thinking of the very bottom tiers are your basic human needs, and towards the top are kind of like things like self-actualization if it's great if you get there, but you really need these things to survive. Think about that the same way for tier 1. You need housing, you need access to food. And if you want to be able to move up in society, it's good to have certain skills, such as literacy skills, so you can read and understand your healthcare, or just read and understand information you need on a day-to-day basis, and numeracy skills, to know, like skills with numbers, right? To know how to interpret and understand the world and information around you. So tier 1 are socioeconomic factors. And again, a couple of examples include housing programs, raising the minimum wage, sanitation efforts. Those are just a couple of examples. Tier 2 has a really long title. The title that I want you to remember is called Changing the Context. Let me give you the full name. The name is Changing the Context to Make Individuals' Default Decisions Healthy. What's a default decision? It's kind of like that reflex. You have a reflex and you want that reflex, whatever that outcome is, to be a healthy option. You want to do something about changing either the built environment or the physical environment around the person healthier so that their default option is still healthy. Think about this as fluoridating water, or even putting chlorine in water, right? Or, prior to the 1970s and 80s, lead used to be in our paint, and people would get lead poisoning, which negatively impacts our central nervous system. So what did we do? We removed lead from paint. We've also made unleaded gas, which is what's your go-to, so that when there's combustion, when your car's burning fuel, that you're not getting exposed to lead, right? So tier 2 is called Changing the Context, and this tier really does focus on the built and physical environment. Let's change something about the world around people to make it easier for them to live healthy lives. Tier 3 are long-lasting protective interventions. If your mind is like, I think I know a good example for this. I think it could be immunizations. Well, then you are right on. And if not, get there. So with tier 3, you've got long-lasting protective interventions, and it's really a behavior that you can take or someone can kind of impact on you, that you do it one time or you only do it a couple of times, but it's got really long-lasting effects. So take, for instance, immunizations, right? So on an immunization schedule, many of you got your measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. You probably got a chickenpox vaccine. You probably got hepatitis B vaccine at some point, possibly. You probably got, whooping cough or a polio vaccine. And these are diseases that you never anticipate popping up in your life. And you don't even have to think about it, because a long time ago, most likely, your parents decided or caregiver decided, I'm going to take my child to these primary care visits and get these vaccinations, and we won't even have to think about this ever being an option, right? So again, think of tier 3 as that long-lasting protective intervention. If you want another example, the reading gives you an example of a colonoscopy. Colonoscopy is a tool that's used to screen for and treat precancerous growths, also known as polyps, that can turn into colon cancer. Not everyone will develop polyps, but around age 50, you start screening for them. There are tests that people can provide a stool sample, so basically poop, and you can send off part of that stool sample to see if there's blood in your stool. Now, that could be indicative of a couple things. That could be indicative of hemorrhoids or bleeding during a bowel movement. It could mean a couple of different things, but it also could mean that it's a sign that you've got these growths that you would never even feel, that are growing in your small or large intestine that might be precancerous growths. So when you get a colonoscopy, you drink this really gross mixture of just disgusting solution. You fast for a while, meaning you don't eat, right? And the next day, you're put under anesthetics, you put under anesthesiology, or you receive anesthetics, and someone puts a large scope, kind of like a little camera on it, in your rectum, and they're looking through your body. The scope is looking for these polyps that you would never have known that you have. And if a physician sees one, they'll remove it. And that in turn is greatly reducing your chance of developing colon cancer. So that's why colon cancer has also been kind of put on that list of more preventable cancers, because there are signs and symptoms that you can see that if you're getting necessary screening, you can help greatly prevent or greatly reduce your risk of actually developing cancer. So that's a test that's conducted more often, once every 10 years, unless you have a family history. And in that case, or if you've had a lot of polyps in the past, in that case, you go once every 5 years. But most often, older adults get it once every 10 years. And it's the gold standard test to help people prevent this preventable cancer. All right, so again, Tier 1, socioeconomic factors. Tier 2, just remember it being called changing the context. And think about, again, that outside context around your life. Tier 3, long-lasting protective interventions. Think about immunizations. And Tier 4 are clinical interventions. So checking in with your healthcare provider. I know we've talked a little bit about HIV, because that was one of my, that's kind of one of the populations I work with, are HIV positive folks. And more often I've seen patients go in once every 3 months, sometimes once every 6 months, but more often once every 3. What they're doing is they're checking with their provider, they're doing a blood test, and they're looking to see how their CD4 and T cell count are doing and how they're doing for their viral load. They want to get their viral load super low so that basically it's really, really hard to pass the virus. And they want to get their immune functioning way high so that it's almost as if they don't have anything wrong with their body in the first place, except that they're taking antiretroviral therapy and they're also at risk for other comorbidities. But they're going in on a regular basis and monitoring their health, monitoring their blood, monitoring for other comorbidities, getting vaccines as necessary. Because of their immunosuppression, they're at higher risk for other outcomes, right? The same would be if someone is diabetic, right, for type 1 or type 2, and they're regularly checking their insulin, they're regularly checking their blood sugar, right? They're regularly monitoring their diet, and they're regularly seeing a provider, getting medications or prescriptions for medications as needed. They're checking in with that provider. So again, when you're thinking of where does the healthcare system fall into this pyramid, really Tier 4. Tier 4 is where we've got clinical interventions. All right, last but not least, we've got Tier 5. Tier 5 is counseling and education. So when people typically think of public health, they think of public health practitioners as talking about safe sex and giving people education and telling them how to live healthier lives. We, of course, know that public health is a little bit more intensive than just giving people information. It's also social policy and kind of incorporating these other tiers. But it is an important part of public health, is empowering patients, empowering populations with information that they can use and they can act on it. But we also know that sometimes just giving people information, telling them how to have a healthier life doesn't necessarily translate into people will now prevent and control disease because they just have information. So the responsibility in Tier 5 with counseling and education is really on the individual with whom you're giving the information, the patient, the parent, the child, the whomever, right? You're giving someone information. They have that information. They've got to take it and translate it into action. So again, that's Tier 5. So I'll go through one more time for anyone who needs it. Tier 1, socioeconomic factors. Think of those factors that really impact income, finance, housing, and the funds you need to have your most basic needs. Tier 2 is changing the context of the built or physical environment around someone, making that default behavior easier for the person. Making sure something is in their environment, making sure there's availability of something that they need, making sure there's fluoride and chlorine in the water to kill off all the bad stuff as well as protect your teeth. There are these things that people do to change the environment, to remove lead from gas, to remove lead from paint, are ways that we've changed the environment around us to make living or healthier, like to make the default health decisions and health outcomes healthier. Tier 3, long-lasting protective intervention, think immunization. Tier 4, clinical interventions, think, again, just focus on the word clinic, right, for clinical interventions. And last but not least, tier 5, counseling and education. So the way that this differs from other healthcare models is this also incorporates the social determinants of health, because old models used to focus mostly on clinic and clinical interventions. This takes more into consideration. It no longer focuses just on clinical interventions. And then also the biggest bang for your buck would be tier 1, but it would require the most amount of resources to make a change at that socioeconomic level. Think how hard that might be and what we have to do, what kind of planning to raise minimum wage, where are we going to find those funds, what policymakers are going to be at the table, what are other outcomes that might occur from this, who might it impact, right? Tier 1 would take the most amount of energy and resources to change, but it would also have the largest impact on populations. Tier 5 would require the least amount of resources, the least amount of investment from a government perspective, but it would also require a lot more energy and time and focus from the individual who will benefit from it to be responsible for ensuring that that level is successful. Okay, well, that's it for Friedens Health Impact Pyramid, and we will keep moving on.